So let me start first of all with a bit on global history. We said earlier how tiresome it is to say what is global history, and this is what we teach to our students. And I find it tiresome myself, being the lecturer in global history, when people ask me what this field is about. In the sense that it's much easier to say what global history is not than actually to say what it is, to have a positive definition. And here I put there a few definitions of what global history is not. And some of them are actually very contentious definitions, because, for instance, the first one, I believe Anna would totally disagree, that global history is not local history, and I think this afternoon she will try to convince you that the global and the local interact a great deal. But it is true that a lot of historians would say that global history stands at the opposite end of a spectrum, at least in geographical terms, in materially geographical terms, from an interest in the locality. That global history might have as the center of its attention larger parts of the world, larger than the local. This doesn't mean that the local should not be analyzed in a global perspective, but a great deal of global history that has been done so far actually is concentrated very much on the description of very often the interaction between continents. The second thing is that very often global history is defined in opposition to national history, in the sense that you realize out of your own experience of engagement with history how a lot of history is still contextualized within national boundaries. And part of the exercise from, let's say, the 1960s of engagement with global history has been partially to transcend some of the structures of the nation states. In particular, the nation states as defined within a European historiography and as a concept and a reality materialized from the early modern period onwards. For instance, embracing concepts such as civilizations, or starting talking about empires as a different way, or starting putting the emphasis about exchange without really trying to define what is the area, the geographic area that you are considering. Of course, this problem of trying to transcend national history carries with it a problem in the tools that we use, one of which we already encountered is that most of this national history are characterized by specific languages. So if you do French history, you will know a bit of French. If you do Chinese history, you might have some knowledge of Chinese, what I don't. And in a sense, then the global historian is accused of having a direct interest in historiography and places in which he or she might not have the tools, like the linguistic tools. But very often is also access to the historiography of these places that is the contentious issue. The third point is that very often the global history, I think, refers to the history of continents. If one would do a kind of word count of what are the geographic entities cited in global history books and what we think are the classic texts of global history, I think continents like Asia, Europe, the Americas would be probably the most common geographic reference. But this does not mean that necessarily global history is actually interested in studying these specific continents. Quite often, actually, global history is interested in studying subparts of continents, or trying to see, as recently it has been done, for instance, with the concept of Eurasia, a geographic dimension that is actually quite different from any traditional continent. The other thing that's the fourth point that I have there is that global history, I say there, is not always the study of the globe as one unit, or even I could have stopped also the study of the globe. in the sense that there is very often a misunderstanding that the unit of analysis in global history should be the entire world. That's not the case. In fact, it's very rarely the case, I would say. And again, in recent years, we had a great deal of discussion. In particular, I'll mention it in a few minutes, the difference between world and global history, in particular on what the geographic unit of analysis might be. And so far I've used mostly a geographic definition of global history. Because the last one that I really like very much, it comes from William McNeill, it says that global history is history in which we know what to leave out. And in a sense, it takes us away from a geographic definition of history, in which what changes then is the topic, and says actually global history is a way of writing history, and he thinks that what is central to the skills of a global historian is actually to be able to be selective on evidence. That is, in a sense, exactly the opposite of what normal historians think, because the work of the historian has been, through the archival work, mostly contextualized in terms of providing additional evidence, very often new evidence, to a specific problem that has normally a pedigree in terms of historiographies. This is a kind of general, very general introduction, negative in the sense of what is not. And I hope during this week we will have much more to say, and many more things to say about the nature of the field that we are considering. The second point I want to make is why global history is becoming now, being a topic of so much interest, and not a generation ago. And partially, I think this boils down to a concept that we use in everyday speech, that is the concept of globalization. And you will find references in newspapers that we live in a globalizing world, or perhaps no longer, since a few months ago. In fact, I'm wondering if this type of explanation that supports the interest in global history will change after this economic crisis. Globalization is clearly a phenomenon that has been mostly seen as a phenomenon starting from the 1970s and into the 1990s, although some historians of global history have tried to create a history of globalization that I still think is different, slightly different from global history. It might be a sub-part of global history, but I refuse to think that global history is simply a history of globalization, although I realize how for the everyday person on the street, it might be interpreted as such. And clearly, globalization, although slightly different from global history, presented to us some new context and some problems that weren't there really in the public domain before, let's say, the late 80s, the end of communism and so on. In particular, I put there just a few new systems of communication like the internet, email. All of you wanted to be connected to the world from this room this morning. A high degree of economic interconnectedness, that seems to be the problem of the last few months, in positive or negative. The power of large corporations, and our universities has given a literary prize to Naomi Klein a few weeks ago, clearly working on this specific topic within globalization, but also the fear of cultural homogenization and so on. The list is very long. But clearly the global dimension has become, in the public imagination, quite central. It has been reified. And that I think has increased the interest also for the global history as a historical discipline. Surely for our students, I see more and more students coming to us with our courses at undergraduate level because they seem to want to learn more about the present. So there is an idea that global history might give some replies about the present. Methodologies. I always like methodology. I'm one of the few who like methodologies. And I should, because global history is actually quite theoretical, in the sense that a great deal of discussion in global history has been not just in defining what global history might be, but also how global history should be done. What exactly do we have to do as historians? And the way in which historians have replied to how to do global history is by drawing on two possible methodologies, and I put them all both together. You will see the recent discussion, in particular since the publication of Ken Pomeran's The Great Divergence. There has been a great deal of discussion on this relationship between the comparative and the connective methodologies. What am I talking about? The course that we show you that we teach to undergraduates called Galleons and Caravans is clearly a course that embraces a vision of global history, although we don't do the entire globe, as in terms of connective methodology. We are interested mostly in connections across the globe. Connective types of history are both economic and cultural, in the sense, for instance, history of trade is fully part of a connective methodology. It often talks about the relationship between different places exchanging goods. But if we just remain within the field of material exchange, you realize that it's not just an exchange of valuable commodities. These commodities are also artifacts. That's what we are here about. And very often they have meaning, in particular cultural meanings, for all parties involved in the transaction. And so you realize how the economic and the cultural in this type of methodology very often are mixed together quite closely. The other point that I underline is that connections across the globe are not always positive. There is a tendency to see connection as extremely positive and enriching. So if we exchange goods, we can know each other better. But actually in the history, in particular the period we are considering, the late medieval and early modern period, connection were also structured around very negative phenomena, and there put exploitation, war, slavery, and so on. That should not be ignored, otherwise we have a very skewed picture of the world that we are considering. The other type of methodology that historians use is the comparative one. The comparative methodology, of course, goes back to Mark Bloch. That's a very long tradition, surely, within European history, and was resurrected, if you want, in the late 1990s, as I mentioned earlier, by Ken Pomeran's with the idea of the Great Divergence. That is a book entirely interested in comparing different parts of the world, some parts of China with some parts of Europe, not really in the connections between these different parts of Eurasia. And comparative methodologies, I still believe, and you might convince me that I'm wrong, that are quintessentially used in social sciences because they can be fairly easily modeled, much more than when you talk about connections. And so they are kind of favorite tool of the social sciences. The other difference compared to the connective methodologies is that they're very often based on in-depth studies of the areas that you consider. You cannot really think about doing a comparison between the Yangtze Delta and Britain without knowing these two areas very well. But you might think about studying the connection between, I don't know, the mills in Lancashire and some parts of India without actually going into a lot of details of any of them. The comparative methodology is actually quite difficult in the sense that it's always problematic what you compare. It's not easy to identify units that can be comparable across the world. I make it short, but just to give you a flavor of what we what historians think are the two major methodologies. But it would be far too easy if there were only two, because I think there are actually many more. I think at least there are another two that are less well known, but actually have been quite important in global history. But in the last decade or so have become a bit more of a niche type of methodology. One is what I call the holistic methodology, in which it is the case that you could really consider the globe as one unit. And I give you there the example of David Christian's maps of time as the quintessential example of this holistic methodology, in the sense that the unit of analysis is not even the globe, is the universe. And if you have read the book, it's a big book. It starts with the Big Bang. The first 100 pages are the first 10 seconds of existence of this universe, and then I think man appears about page 300, and then our period is really squeezed into 50 pages towards the end. And he tried, just with this distribution of pages, in letting us understand also the importance of history compared to all the rest, not just prehistory, but the history of the universe. And of course, you realize that by having man appearing so late in the book, he had a problem of narrative there. You know, it had to keep up some interest in the reader and introduce clearly science and biology as central concepts driving his own history. And there have been quite a few studies, if not so long, that clearly put at the center not man, but that put at the center nature. Crosby, for instance, on the Columbian Exchange, McNeill himself talking about germs, and the same Jared Diamond, and so on. The final one is what I call systemic, in which the world is divided into not just areas, but areas that have a relationship with each other. And the best example, clearly, of a systemic analysis is Immanuel Wallerstein, who from the 1970s, I believe I have there, from the 1970s onwards, presented a kind of vision of global history into 3 volumes from 1974 to 1989, in which he tried to tell a story by plotting this story, and this was the story of the emergence of a capitalist world that was really centered on Europe, although he refused to think that it was a Eurocentric world, but that was structured in such a way in which there were relations of dominance and power, very often economic power, between areas. So it's not just that these areas might be empire or states, but actually it's the relationship between these areas that is important. And he distinguished famously between cores, peripheries, and semi-peripheries. Very interesting is also the fact that the world that he was describing was not the entire world, because some areas like parts of Central Asia and most of Africa were excluded from the world. They did not belong to the world. It's a very interesting way of analyzing what the world might be. Clearly, in a sense, less geographic than what we might think. If you haven't read, Patrick O'Brien's provide an interesting analysis. This was the first issue of the Journal of Global History. An interesting historiographical analysis of global history as a way of writing history, and he claims that the interesting global history that I've contextualized as a very recent thing, probably from the 1970s, 60s and 70s onwards, in reality claims goes back really to Greek and Roman history. And he claims that global history had a very bad moment during the 19th century, in particular when the nation states seemed to dominate as a driving force, surely in Europe, but across the world, in particular across the world through the system of empire. And then he claims that from the mid-20th century, there has been a resurgence of global history, but global history has also new problems. In particular, since the 1960s, we have seen a double wave, and this is perhaps the most contentious bit of what I'm going to tell you today, in the sense that historians have seen a difference between global history and world history. The more I look into it, the more I find it doesn't exist. So, although you have a slide from me saying that these are completely different areas, in reality they overlap substantially. World history in French Storia Mondiale and Italian Storia Mondiale has been used since the 1960s, especially in the US, and that's coincided with the teaching of very large survey courses that did not exist in Europe at all. Central to the idea of world history is the idea of civilization. In fact, McNeill's famous book of 1963 used the concept of civilization as a central device to structure the narrative, a global narrative. Global history, in a sense, I see it as part of world history, but it's slightly different because it has emerged mostly as a specialization of continental Europe and the UK. In the last decade, or a bit more, 15 years, is taught not really into this, through these survey courses, in the sense that, for instance, Galleon Caravans that we teach is not a survey course at all. It doesn't really try to be comprehensive, doesn't use a textbook, it's thematic, somewhat random, you can say. Is based on connections, is based on comparison, but most of all seems to be based, in terms of research, on a very strong theoretical structure that I don't want to say did not exist in world history, but world history tried to provide a bigger picture in terms of narrative, rather than to start with a problem. I think in global history, the problem is much more central. But as I said, this distinction is not totally evident. In fact, I think there is very much of a convergence going on these days between global and world historians. Ken Pomeranz, I had a long discussion, said that he did not accept this division at all. Although he is one of the editors of the Journal of Global History that is based in the UK and has been active since 2006. And then there is a Journal of World History that has been published since 1990 and is US based. So institutionally there is a difference clearly between the two areas. What else did I want to say? We have seen as one central paradigm in world/global history in the 1970s was Immanuel Wallerstein's idea of a world system. Since 2000, discussion in global history has been dominated by very different issues, and in particular have been rotating around the idea of divergence, from the title of Kenneth Pomeranz's book. It's not terribly important that you learn everything about divergence. He claims that the world in which we live now is very different from the early modern world, what we're interested in this summer school, essentially because of a phenomenon that has been in European history contextualized in terms of industrialization and seen as quintessentially European. And he claims that actually this is not a European phenomenon. He calls it divergence. It can happen everywhere, and it was reliant on two specific factors: the famous colon colony, the double C. I often comment with my students that in my other course, the double C is Coco Chanel. I teach a course in history of fashion. And for my global history course, the double C is coal and colonies. And he arrives to the conclusion that from a common path within Eurasia, and this is a path, a very much economic path, this is an economic model, the two paths of Eurasia diverge dramatically, leading to industrialization and increased standards of living in Europe, but not at the other end of Eurasia, specifically in China. I don't go into the critique of that, but I wanted just to cite divergence, because so much of what has been written in the last decade addresses the problem of divergence. You might see seeping through the summer school. We might wish to come back at the end and see how much we can actually ignore divergence when we consider material culture. It's a very interesting topic. But I wanted to make sure that this is cited in terms of how global history has evolved.